Now we're going to take a look at view controls. The first thing we're going to do is go to the common section and scroll all the way down to tracker controls. Now this is only for VR users and I believe track IR users. This is a fairly important key binding as it will reset where the default position of your head is whenever you're moving your head around in your room. I would put this somewhere that you can press easily enough that you won't accidentally press it. You will need to press this button quite a bit if you're taking your headset on and off. I can't speak for every headset, but for the Rift S and the Quest 2, it'll probably reset the tracking a lot if you take it on and off, since they have inside-out tracking. So you may not need to use this key binding that much, you may need it, but it's there if you need it. Next, in the view control section, we have zoom camera. And if you noticed, go to the ground vehicles section, there's also a zoom camera key binding. The differences between these are that, well, one, this one's for all vehicle types, and whereas this one is just for tanks. And this one's a toggle, whereas the tanker one's more of a shift, as in you hold it down, it zooms in, and then as soon as you let go, it zooms out. I definitely recommend binding this to something. I have mine, for example, bound to modifier button 1 plus button 5. I'll show you in a bit, but I use button 5 as my camera button. It does a lot of things. I'll show you in a few minutes. Mouse look activation is something that you're going to want if you are using a mouse, obviously, and if you're not using VR or track IR. If you're using VR, you cannot use this key binding. It won't work. If you're using track IR, it may work. I don't know. I don't know why you'd want to use it. You can try it. I don't have track IR, so I can't test it. But it doesn't work for VR. So if you're using VR, don't even worry about it. The rest of this stuff is self-explanatory, or it's not that important. So we're going to take a look at the aircraft. We have several different camera controls here. We have toggle view, which cycles between all these other views below it. We have cockpit view, which puts you into the cockpit of the plane. We have external view. This is the third-person view that you see most people playing the game with. Virtual cockpit. It's like cockpit, except the plane is invisible. Default view is whatever you have set in the battle interface under current view. I prefer cockpit since I'm a VR player. Pick whichever one you want, but the only one available for sim is cockpit view. Next, we have gunner view. Gunner view lets you control your gunners manually. It puts you either in a third-person view, or it'll put you in a gunner seat if the plane only has one gunner. We have bomber view. Not every plane has a bomber view or a gunner view. I believe bomber view is also the gimbal view for the top-tier planes that have, laser designators and stuff like that. I could be wrong. I don't have any to test it out on. Helicopters, though, very similar, except they have a shooter view, or shooter/ATGM view. This is kind of like that gimbal view I mentioned, where most helicopters, they'll have some sort of camera either on the top or it'll be nose mounted, and it lets you aim the cannon if it has an aimable cannon, and you can also look around, lock onto targets, shoot your ATGMs. That's how you do all that stuff. And then gunner view, if you have an attack helicopter with like a front seater, it'll switch to that front seat view, and you can actually control guns from that view, although it's not as accurate, but you can use that view. I think for the AH-1G, that's the only way you can aim the 40mm turret outside of mouse aim. So that's like the only time I would use it, is in a situation like that. I recommend not relying on toggle view as your only view control, but everyone has their own preferences. The way I have my view controls set up, cockpit view is my default view. I have all my view controls, with the exception of bomber view, bound to the 5 button. Pressing 5 puts me in cockpit view. It also resets my view in battle and my head movement controls, which I will show you in a bit. Modifier button 1 plus 5 as zoom camera. Modifier button 2 plus 5 as gunner view, or for helicopters, it is my ATGM view. Modifier buttons 1 plus 2 and 5 toggles the camera for both helicopters and planes. I do have bomber view set to modifier button 2 and button 7, but that's because I don't really use bomber view that much. That might change in the future, but for right now, that's where I have it. Tracking camera enemy. This is actually a good key binding if you lack sufficient means to track people using separate axes, head tracking, or VR to look around. but it only works in modes that allow you to lock onto players. So it won't work in Sim, and it'll only work in RB if you're a console player, or if you're playing Air RB, or Naval. If you're doing ground RB, you're not going to be able to lock onto anything unless you're a console player. Look down and look back are kind of redundant if you have proper view controls, but they're there for you to try out and see if they are what you were looking for. Lastly, and most importantly, we have the view and head movement controls. Now, despite there not being any head movement controls in the helicopter section, you can see here, there is view and battle, but there's no head movement. You can actually still move your head in helicopters. You just have to bind the controls to the ones here in aircraft. Don't know why, but if you want to be able to move your head around in the helicopters, you have to bind it here. Messing with the view controls here will not affect the helicopter view controls. You have to do that. You have to, rebind everything here in the aircraft controls for the helicopters here. Zoom axis, I don't use it, but if you want to use it, you can. This is a key binding that you could use to adjust the zoom, not just toggle it to its maximum and minimum. You can have it gradually zoom in if you want. This is actually fairly useful for helicopters that have really high zooms for their gimbal cameras. So sometimes you may not want to go in all the way, but for me, it's just too complicated to find a zoom axis that's available that would work on this control scheme. That wouldn't be too funky. Although, I probably could bind the zoom axis to this paddle here, or maybe even the joystick swivel. Maybe not the joystick swivel, just because it'd be too easy to accidentally engage it. But if you want to use the zoom axis and you're not sure where you want to put it, you could very easily put it on this axis, on this pedal, if you have foot pedals, or if you're using this to control your rudder. View and battle, X and Y axis, are not usable in VR. So if you're a VR user, you do not have to worry about this key binding. Although, if you're not in VR, you definitely will want this key binding. As for how will you bind it, I believe this is where you would bind your track IR controls. I don't know. I don't have track IR, but that'd be my guess. If you don't have either VR or track IR, I would recommend using the D-pad on a controller if you're using a controller, or using the hat switch on your HOTAS. If you have more than one hat switch or whatever, that's great. But if you only have one, I would just use that hat switch. Okay, so this is future me again. In the view controls, there's a little something I forgot to record. So what is that thing? When you are in your view controls, and you're specifically the view axes, you can either have, if you're doing relative control, you can have the increase and decrease values here, or you can bind it to an axis. I bet you're wondering, why does that matter? Like, they should both do the same thing? Well, kind of. The way WarThunder works, there are some caveats to this, and I'll show you right here. I haven't got to the trimming video yet, but in the trimming section, I control my trim for the aileron and the elevator with the hat switch right here. Or when I was using a controller, I would control it with the D-pad, which I use my view controls with the D-pad. So how do you, adjust trim controls but not look around? Like, how do you make it to where your axes won't override each other? It's not a surefire way. There are some things that, for the life of me, I can't get to stop overlapping each other. But when it comes to looking around and other things that have a axis adjustment like this, the way you get it to not overlap is by making sure that they are either bound to the same axis up here, or they have the same buttons here. You can't have both, or else then they will overlap, and I'll show you in a minute. So right here we can see elevator and aileron are set to axes 6 and 7. But I have to press a modifier button here, which is my select button. And we go to view controls, you'll notice I have it set to the hat switch's individual buttons. And there's no modifier button there. So if I look around, D-pad, looking up and down, left and right, and if I hold down the trim button and try to turn my aileron to the right, I also look right. And you'll see on the bottom it's moving my trim. If I set this to the axis, left, the same buttons, just the axis, I can get it to not overlap. See here, I'm now moving my aileron trim without having to worry about my camera looking left and right. And it works for the reverse. So you'll see that my view in battle is still bound to the buttons, not the axes. So if I do the elevator trim to the buttons, so up and down, so I'm looking up and down, it also does not overlap. So as long as they are the same buttons or axis, it won't overlap. But there are some places where this won't work. For example, you'll notice my head movement controls, which these are in the aircraft section, but they also work for helicopters. I don't have it bound to an axis with an enable axis button, but what I have it bound to is a combination of the hat switch left and right and holding down modifier button 2 or button 10. So the x-axis has the axis setting, and this one just has the buttons in the setting, up and down. So if I try to move my head left and right, it'll also turn my camera left and right. And if I try to look up and down, or move my head up and down, it'll also move my head up and down. So it doesn't matter in this situation what you do, it's going to overlap anyways. When you are having a axis like this that you're going to constantly be resetting, like head movement, I constantly reset this to the default position. So if you're going to be using this, the reset axis value button, having an enable axis button makes it tricky for it to actually reset. That's why I have it like this and not like the trim settings where I have a button and then I have the D-pad up here. I have these set to a combination of the modifier button and the hat switch or the D-pad using an Xbox controller. And lastly, another thing is the radio messages. Again, haven't gone over this yet, but what I have this all bound to is the hat switch or the D-pad, which is controller 13. I unplugged it because it was interfering. So if I replug it in, you'll see it. Yeah, D-pad. In this case, you'd be like, okay, it should work. It shouldn't overlap with the radio, right? So left and right on the D-pad should theoretically interfere, and up and down shouldn't, because it's bound to buttons. So I turn on the radio, left and right, it overlaps. But up and down, oh, I don't have any radio messages bound up and down, so I'm gonna have to actually bind the buttons to it real quick. So radio messages still overlaps. So it doesn't matter what you do for that, it's gonna overlap. You could bind the radio messages somewhere else or just not use them. You don't really need the radio anyways for most situations. But for the trimming and the looking around, it definitely helps out a lot. Keep that in mind when you're messing with the view controls and the trim controls. If you want certain things to overlap and not overlap, that's how you get it to work. I don't have any modifier buttons to look around, so I will show you here. In fact, let me turn my engine off real quick because this thing's loud. I just look around by pressing only the hat switch. Now, this is where you're really going to go into depth with the axis settings, because there's a ton of different ways you can have your camera controls working, I guess. You could do it the old-fashioned way, where you just move it left, it looks left, move it right, it looks right. I do have a button. I use button 5 is my reset button. It's also my cockpit button, so if I'm like outside or whatever, I press 5, puts me in the cockpit facing forward. And I highly recommend, if you use relative controls, like I'm using here, if you have this ticked, set a reset axis value button. You don't have to do that, but I highly recommend it. As for the nonlinearity dead zone, that's, if you want to do that, do that. However, this is a great time to kind of demonstrate how useful relative control step can be. I'm sure many of you are wondering what relative control sensitivity and relative control step are. So this is actually a great time to show you. So relative control sensitivity is how much it moves left and right when you're holding it. Step is how much it moves when you just tap it. So I'll show you here. I'll raise the control step to 50% and the sensitivity to 100. And this is just for looking in the x-axis. I didn't do it for the y-axis right now. So I reset it. If I hold it down, it looks left. Hold it right, it looks right. If I tap it, sorry, I totally forgot. It doesn't work if you have it bound to an axis only. You actually have to bind the increase and decrease values here, respectively. So for increase value, we're going to want right And for decrease value, we're going to want left. And we're going to make sure, for whatever reason, every time I like close this setting, it lowers the relative control sensitivity like 10%. It's such a weird bug. But now, you'll notice, when I hold it down, it looks right extra fast. That's really weird. Okay, so interesting. If you have an axis bound here, and you bind these buttons, which are the same thing as the axis there too, it counts as like 2 inputs at once. So like doubles the input. That's really interesting. I removed the axis. So now, when I hold down left, there's a slight delay, and then it looks left. Same thing if I'm holding right. That's because now that you have the relative control step enabled, when you tap it, it has to have a... There has to be a time frame where you press it and let go for the relative control step to kick in. So now I can hold it down and look all the way left or all the way right, or I can just quickly tap it and I can cycle between the different percentages. And the neat part about this is, let's say I just look slightly to the right. Well, if I use relative control step, obviously you saw it looked 90 degrees to my right and 90 degrees again to my right. So it was basically going through the range of motion 50%, like I said it there in the axis. But if you only move slightly with the sensitivity and then you move it or you use relative control step, it just goes back to the next notch. It doesn't, like, if I look slightly to the right and then use relative control step, it's not going to point me like, 90 degrees offset a little bit. It'll just put me right back at the notch that like I have the relative control steps to. So if it's at 50%, you're going to have the default 0%. You're going to have 90, or I guess 50%, and then 100%. So it'll cycle, it'll take a 50% step with the view controls. So this is a great way for you to be able to look around freely and also quickly look around in specific directions. You don't even have to have... you can just set the relative control sensitivity to like 10% if you don't even want it moving at all, if you just want to use the relative control step. If you do 25%, again, it'll do it in increments of 25%. See here. So that's a really good way to use this key binding. Another way you can use it is you can turn off relative control. And you can just have it set to a maximum and minimum value. So if I hold right, I look all the way right. And if you adjust the multiplier here, say 50%. If I hold down right, oh, wait, what? Oh, wait, that's why. Okay. So if it's set to an axis, you have to remove these if you want to do it this way. You set it to an axis and you put the multiplier to 50%, it'll only go 50% of the way left and right. But because we had it set as the maximum view, or the maximum input, here, maximum values, that's why it was looking all the way left and right, even though our multiplier was 0.5. Head movement forward, backward, upward, down, left, and right. This is it's not a necessary key binding, but it's helpful. A good example of when you'd want to use this, if you're in a dogfight and the nose of your plane and your sight are very close, as in it's hard to get a leading shot on the plane, you can move your head up and forward and you'll be able to see over your nose a little better. This is really helpful in dogfights. If you're ground pounding, maybe you want to look over to the left or the right side of your plane so you can see the ground targets a little easier. There's different ways to use this. I highly recommend that you bind the head movement controls. It doesn't matter like how you're playing the game. You can use it in VR. Seems weird, but you can use the head movement in VR. I believe you can use it for track IR. I don't know how you bind it for track IR. And obviously, if you're not using either of those, you can still use it too. I have mine bound a similar way to the way I have my view controls. Except the slightest difference is I don't have it bound to an axis. The increase and decrease values, I am holding down button 10, which is modifier 2. The reason why I don't have this set to an axis and just have an enabled axis button be modifier 2. And the reason that is, I'll show you without it real quick, just to kind of demonstrate. So if and it's going to move my camera, by the way, just because of the way I have my controls. So if I press the reset button, it resets it perfectly, no problems. I go here, now I'm going to set it to the axis, left and right. And enable axis is going to be button 10, like these. And I'm just going to get rid of these. Now, if I move it to left and right, you'll notice, one, it doesn't override the view controls. So now I'm looking all the way right. If I press the reset button, it doesn't work. Like you can tell, I'm looking left and right, it doesn't work. I have to hold down the modifier button. It's a little annoying, and sometimes it doesn't work. Like, I'm pressing it right now, and it's like, it's really funky. I don't know what is going on. So here, I'm gonna press it, does nothing. Holding it down, then it does it. Like, it's, I didn't even press button 5 and it reset. It's such a weird button combination. That pretty much concludes the view controls video. So in the next video, I'm gonna go over trimming controls.